IDEO is known as a purveyor of design thinking. And we're absolutely excited that so many people are adopting the mindset. It's been critical to our success and probably to many of your own personal successes as well. But I do have a going concern about design thinking, and it's the misunderstanding of it. The truth is that the methods of design thinking are only half the story, and those are probably the easiest things for people to get their heads around. Right? You can prototype, you can observe, you can fail. We've all done that a lot. But there's the other side of it, it's the sensibilities of design. And the sensibilities are much harder to reproduce. They're much harder to learn, but they're actually the very important aspect that makes design thinking successful. So today, what I want to do is help you understand that. In essence, methods are telling you what and why to do, and sensibilities are telling you how to do it. Right? So you might go through the process and figure out what needs to be done, but then how do you actually accomplish that in a way that's desirable? Now, a lot of people think that that aspect, that sensibility, is subjective. That aesthetics, style, beauty, harmony, rhythm, you know, it's one person's opinion versus another person's opinion. But what I hope to show you today is that that's not the case at all. There's actually something essential to our humanity that can help us to see one design is better than another design. So to help you figure that out, and to illustrate it, I'm going to give you a test. This is not the standardized test or pencil we use for later. But I want to know, of the two chairs on the screen, which chair do you think is better? A better design, A or B? A. That was interesting. All right. How about these two? B. Huh. How about these guys? Who is still listening to a creative nomad? All right, 0. Okay, so I think it was intuitively obvious. I heard consensus on every slide. But I think that's pretty hard for most of us to explain. Well, in 1977, this guy, George Nelson, an iconic designer, he was the design director for Herman Miller for 30 years. He wrote a book called How to See. I really recommend you get this book. It's an amazing book. He was trying to write a book. It was a guide to visual fluency. He thought if the world could become visually literate, we would be happier, there would be peace, it would be a more beautiful place. And he was really trying to get to the core of what we just went through, the essence of what makes A better than B. He suggested that our world was filled with visual pollution. He was one of the early adopters of that phrase, promoters of the idea. And he said, really, what we've done is we've brought all these aesthetically offensive elements into the world, and it's actually making the world more anxious and uglier on top of that. And he makes a great case in his book. But here's the thing. Even in his book, he says, you know, I call this book How to See. It's really how I see. I don't really have any evidence for this other than I'm 69 and I've done this my whole career. So I've learned something. But I don't have any backing. Well, I think 40 years later we have backing for George. I think there's scientific evidence that what he is saying is true. So let me take you through some studies to help you see that. A couple years ago, I started noticing studies in the news about psychological tests. And I found them very interesting because they connected our senses and our emotions. So for example, in this study, there was professors from Hong Kong and the University of Colorado found that in cold weather, like we have now, people rent more romance films. All right, and the assumption there is that we're looking for emotional warmth and we're physically cold. Here's another one about warmth. This one was from Yale. And they found that when people in the study were holding a warm cup of coffee, they perceived others as more open, more warm. And when they were holding a cold cup, they perceived others as more off-putting or more calloused. And this one from the University of Amsterdam. Workers were given a task. Some were given a clipboard that was heavy, others were given a clipboard that was light. And those who had the heavy clipboard took their task more seriously than those who held the light clipboard. So we were associating the heaviness, the weightiness of that clipboard with importance of the task. All right, now we're going to tell a joke. The science lesson has to pause for a second. It'd be too much. It's 9 a.m.
Turn your mic off.
Yeah. And so this joke is, I attribute this joke to my colleague and friend, Colin Rainey, right here in the second row. All right. But first, you need your pencil. What I want you to do is take your pencil and put it in your teeth like this. Everyone's been doing it, so you won't put it on. You all look good. All right. What's green? Has 6 legs, and if it falls out of a tree, will kill you. A pool table. All right. Thank you, Colin. All right. So, according to this next study, you enjoyed that joke more because of the pencil in your teeth. So, several studies have found that when people have pencils in their teeth like that, they're activating the very same muscles that make you smile. And when those muscles are activated, you're actually cueing physical happiness, and you enjoy things more. So if you're at a boring dinner party, just as a suggestion, take your knife. You'll be fine. All right. So these studies, and a lot more like them, are out there right now, and they're giving us as evidence that correlates our emotions with our 5 senses. It's pretty amazing. And the way they correlate them is through metaphor, language metaphor. Now, before I had run into these studies, I'd only thought of metaphor as a poetic instrument. But I started to realize that it was something more, that it's probably a hint at something essential about our human experience. And it sounded a lot more like what George Nelson was trying to teach us about in 1977. So I had to dig into this. And it led me to another academic field, cognitive linguistics. So at the very same time that George Nelson was writing his book, this guy named George Lakoff, a Berkeley professor, was also writing a book. He was in this battle with Noam Chomsky. It was like East versus West. And they were having a debate over the origins of language. Chomsky said language was inherent in our humanity. And Lakoff said, I don't think so. I think it's developed experientially. And the way he made his argument was using language metaphor. In the end, Lakoff was really right. He started a whole new field of study called cognitive linguistics, which you've probably heard before. And what he was doing was debunking this idea that somehow language existed outside of human experience. So he wrote this book called Metaphors We Live By. It came out in 1980. It's another interesting book. It gets a little heady toward the end. But the first, 8 chapters are great. What he does is he shows how language is built on visceral experience. It's not disembodied. It's not coming from some kind of sense of reason. It's actually coming through the way we experience the world. So let me give you an example. If so far what I've said feels like it's over your head, that would be an experiential metaphor, wouldn't it? Like it's up here somewhere. Now the only reason we would be able to have that kind of idea would be through personal experience of having things out of our reach. Yes, these are phrases we use all the time. So I wrote George Lakoff once I stumbled across this and said, hey, what do you think? I'm a designer. I'm starting to see these studies. I read your book. I think maybe there's a hint at, as designers talk about what we create, we use metaphors all the time. Do you think there's some kind of connection? And George says, yeah, very reasonable. I was like, yes, this is cool, right? And you get that kind of confirmation. So here's where we're going with that. I think in today's business climate, rationale and justification are everything, right? Here in the business school, you definitely have to do that financially. But here's the thing. I think rationale is a Cartesian trap, right? It's a form of thinking, but it's not the only way to think. It's conscious thinking. Now, conscious thinking takes about 3% of our brain's activity. So you have to wonder what that other 97% is doing, right? Even right now, your 97% is pretty active. So the thing about subconscious thinking, though, is it's not as if it's you're driving and it's in the passenger seat reading the newspaper. There's actually something you're both driving, and your subconscious is helping you understand the world. So this is where it leads me back to design. If you only trust your conscious thought when you're recognizing design or looking at design, you're really omitting the majority of your understanding of that design. You're just pushing it out of the brain. Now, this is interesting. There's been a number of brain scans studies lately that say that when we're imagining something or experiencing something, it's all the same to our brain. The same nodes of our mind are being activated. All right, that's pretty wild, right? So if you're imagining you're cold or you're outside freezing, to your brain, it's actually the same thing. It's actually cueing the same things. It suggests that whether we perceive or imagine, it's all like action to the brain. So thinking back to those early studies, it makes sense that people are connecting things like romance films with cold weather, right? Because your brain's trying to accomplish the same thing, right? You want that warmth. Or it makes sense that we perceive people as warmer when we're sitting warm. We are associating things because physically our minds actually do that already. And this is why it matters for design. It turns out that visual metaphors or physical metaphors, spoken or experienced, are all the same to the brain. And that's human experience, right? That's something you can tap into as a designer, as a creator, to actually make something more desirable, more effective, more useful. So let me show you how this plays out in the real world. Now, how many of you said when you're working on a project that you'd like to be like Apple? Right? One. Great. So let's look at the Apple store. I mean, Apple's brand is clean and futuristic. But what are the unconscious symbols that Apple uses to help you feel that way about them? Right? So they have interesting things there. You have glass. You have glass. Glass is transparency. Glass is purity. You have a lot of white, also the same kind of concept. You have high tables to lean against. Interesting thing, another study, when you think about the future, you lean forward. When you think about the past, you lean backward. So Apple is a future-thinking brand, has you leaning forward. Very cool. Each of these is telegraphing the metaphor of the brand. Right? Now, you may have not thought of any of that when you were actually in the Apple store, but you felt it and you believe it, because that's what the Apple brand promises, and that's what it delivers. Let's try another one. BMW. A lot of you will have these sometime in your career. Remember, from the study, in the clipboard study, we found out weight makes things important, right? So BMW knows this. Now, you don't want to make a car heavy, but you want to create perceptions of safety. Right? So when they were designing the hinges for the doors, they added tension to the doors. That tension makes the doors heavier, or the perception of heaviness. Right? And that perception of heaviness makes you feel safer. It makes you feel more value in that car. Now, you might be thinking that's manipulative. Right? And it kind of is, but not in an evil way. Let me show you evil. This is a famous ad before most of your times. You look at those ice cubes, and you can see subliminal messaging in there. Pretty amazing. Now, this is manipulative in a much worse way, right? It's trying to make you a connection to a commodity that's completely irrelevant. Kind of. Well, it should be irrelevant. They're trying to manipulate you just to like something that's not very great, right? They're trying to manipulate you not to enhance the experience of the product, but to deceive you into liking that product. You see the difference between the BMW hinges and the gym? So what I'm interested in is using this knowledge to design things that appeal to the subconscious to make products better, or experiences better, or ideas better. And I think we have some tools that can help you do that as well. So today I'm going to give you some of those tools, or at least let you start playing with them. And we'll see where it goes. I hope you participate in this with me. Now here's another example of warmth. And there's a couple cues happening in this photo. And this is about visual literacy again, but the light in this photo is warm. Yeah, and then the product is warm too. I mean, wood has a natural warmth to it. Supple leather has a natural warmth. This is a really warm image. Yes? All right. You haven't touched it though, and you haven't smelled it. You've only looked at it. But so you've had all these other experiences in your life that are informing you right now about this image. So there was a group of us at the IDEO studio here in Cambridge that tried to start to map this in some way. And we started with the 5 senses. And I've put a URL here. You can download this particular map and play with it if you want. Improve it, send it back to me. What we're trying to do is map your 5 senses to your emotions. So let me show you an example. So I've highlighted sound here. You can see it's also connected to sight. And we're going to look at some things that sound old, fresh, raw. And you can see that we put words beneath those that you probably use to describe design. So we'll start with the root metaphor of fresh, which you can hear, you can see, you can smell. And we'll apply it to something we know. So let's look at these 2 apples. One is probably more desirable to you than the other. Which one is it? All right, the fresh one. Again, this is all visual, right? How did you know that? It's not wrinkly. Ah, that was good. So a couple years ago, we went to a challenge with a client. They wanted us to design a product based on their current manufacturing methods. They thought it was a brand problem. It was, but actually it was a product and brand problem. The product didn't live up to the promise. The product was supposed to be luxurious. It was supposed to be fresh. It was supposed to be advanced. And the method they were using to create that actually created wrinkles in the product itself. And so we said, you know, we've got this design, and if we make this design on your current manufacturing setup, you'll really not deliver the promise of the product. But what you need to do is buy some more machinery. So that goes over really well when you're asking your client to invest in capital. And so we argued about it for a while, because for a while it just sounded like an aesthetic argument or a designer subjective argument. But then we showed them this image. Hey. And we said, which one would you like? And they said the same thing you wanted. They wanted this one. We said, this is why you can't use your other manufacturing line, and you have to buy new equipment. And they instantly got it, right? They said, oh, now I get it. There's something else happening in my subconscious in the way I understand the world, that our clients are understanding the world. that would make us invest in something to give us the plump, crisp, firm lines versus the wrinkly lines. And this is that design. You can see the old saggy product and the new plump product. Very simple application, but essential to them being successful, we believed, in the market. Let's try another one. Fruit. Fruit's always good. Use fruit for a metaphor all the time. Work for apple, work for blackberry. Just think about it. So we created an identity for a startup here in Cambridge. They were called Axio. Now, Axio sounds kind of violent, maybe like an axe murderer, maybe like a villain from a Marvel comic. And we said, you know, you really got to rename yourself because that just sounds violent and horrible. And what we did is we dove into what they were all about. They're all about measuring your brainwaves. They're all about helping you find focus, find flow. And they had some hardware and software that allow you to track that. So we decided to call them Melon. Melon's a lot more friendly. It's optimistic. It can be, it's kind of juicy. Right? Juicy makes you feel good. Makes it juicy. It's quiet and confident, like the product itself. And it doesn't sound like a villain, does it? Melon. Like, oh, it's attractive. It's approachable. Let's try another one. We'll look at the root metaphor of old. Now, old can be positive or negative. And we're going to make it positive here. A way you might think of old as a positive would say something wears in, something ages well, right? So leather does that. Classic guitars do it. And Chuck Taylors do it. I would say like a third of you have them on right now. Chuck Taylors are awesome. They tell stories. They tell your story. They're your diary that you wear every day. So when we designed the store for Converse, we said we need to have that idea as an aesthetic of the store, right? Because we want the product in the store to be the same. We want to be able to tell stories and tell history. And so we designed that into the store itself. You can see the bleachers are worn, the floor is worn, the leather around the columns is worn, just like your favorite pair of Chucks. Right? And those are good connotations. You don't feel worn out. You feel like it's worn in. All right. So now think back to the apples. In that case, it was a visual experience. But deeper than that, it's a common human experience. We're surrounded by visual cues all the time, like this puddle. And we've been surrounded by these for millions of years as a species. So on the puddle you see, in the sidewalk you see this puddle. It's shiny, it's attractive, it's reflective. It's a signal for sustenance. It's beautiful. It's about hydration. If you're as a child, what do you do when you see a puddle? It's just desirable, right? You can't resist it. Now apply it to circumstances we have culturally. Right, I think it's very interesting that engagement rings are these bright, shiny puddles on people's matte skin. Right, you're attracted to it. You want to be there with it. You're interested. As opposed to, as a parent, you know, as opposed to this, where this is also a beautiful ring, but it's signaling something entirely different, isn't it? It's absorbing light. It's more subdued. The Apple Mouse, so it does the same thing, doesn't it? It's the oasis in the middle of your messy desktop. It's there asking you to reach out and touch it, and you want to touch it. It's amazing. But what if they had taken the river stone and used the matte surface? It would have disappeared, right? It wouldn't be the same. So I think it turns out that the way George saw the world is actually the way we can see the world. But these metaphors are actually the bridges to our subconscious and the bridges to understanding design. And interestingly, we've gone from, I think, what was really pushed aside to the realms of intuition, to now we've tied it back to science, right? And one cautionary tale I want to have for you here is that I don't want you to think I'm trying to over-rationalize everything we do as designers. I think that would be very boring, be a very boring world. But I am trying to give you some equipment or tools to understand design better, to talk about design better, and to make decisions better about design. Right? If the only decision you're making about design is a financial decision or number of people that engage with it, that's probably you're probably missing something in the way that you're judging that design. So I'll end with this. If you thought anything I was said today was important, it was probably because I used a heavy font. Thanks.